Speaking for the trees, no matter where they're from. The podcast.
Okay. Did you get a little notification over there of
Yeah.
recording in progress?
Uh-huh.
Okay, cool. All right. Okay, so today we're joined by Paul Moss. He's the executive director of the Plant Initiative, and he's the author of a recent report that the Plant Initiative put out in December called Towards a Plant Advocacy Movement. And so, Paul, if you could start off just telling us a little bit about yourself and, your qualifications, your background, and how this all came to be for you with the
Okay,
Plant
sure.
Initiative.
Well, yeah, thanks so much. Really happy to be here with you today and have the opportunity to talk about this. So, I have been interested in really the human-plant connection for my whole life, just since I was a kid, and now I'm 67 years old. So it's been for a long time. And I think one of the things that's really intrigued me about the topic of how humans connect with plants is just what are plants, and are plants, able to sense things? Are they intelligent? What exactly are they? And I think that scientific research over the past decades, and even when I was younger, there had been some scientific research as early as, the late 1800s and early 1900s, which really examined, how plants are sentient beings. And I think that, and there's been a lot more recently done by scientists on that topic. So I think I've always been kind of intrigued with what are the implications of that. So if plants are sensing and plants are intelligent, what does that mean in terms of how humans, especially in our dominant culture, how we should be treating plants? So anyway, in terms of my background, I have an undergraduate degree in biology, and I have a master's degree in agriculture and agronomy. And I also have an MBA in marketing. And right now I'm a non-traditional student working on a PhD in geography, environment, and society. And one of the things that I'm interested in studying right now are some of the ethical issues about how we relate to crop plants grown in an agricultural context, especially corn. So in terms of the Plant Initiative, I felt like there's really was an opportunity and a niche that was important to fill for people that are looking at plants in this type of a way, through a lens of trying to see how we're treating them, and are we treating them appropriately, and especially for what they really are. And so the Plant Initiative's goal is to help build a movement of people, or to gather people, or provide a catalyst for people that are interested and thinking about plants in a different way, and want to move forward in operationally in terms of trying to better help to treat plants in a more respectful manner.
Yeah, it's excellent. I was really excited to hear about the Plant Initiative last year. Professor Julie Stromberg originally put me in touch with what y'all are doing. I don't know if you know her work at all. She's done at the University of Arizona, but she was a lifelong biologist who taught there, and she recently came out with a book about her. About doing a restoration project of an old, basically old cotton agricultural plot south of Phoenix, that they started this 25 years ago. I had the pleasure of visiting it a couple of months ago, and they now have this, like, what was just a cotton field is now this abundant, garden full of all sorts of, different plants. And of course, they've noticed all the different wildlife that have returned and all this. She recently put a book about that. I interviewed her on my previous podcast at one time. But yeah, it seems like there's some really interesting things you're doing. You've had a couple of different presentations this year with different authors.
Right. The Plant Initiative has been trying to highlight some of people that are doing interesting work in the world of the human-plant connection. So we had a discussion with Prudence Gibson, who was recently an Australian scholar who has recently written a book about some of the stories of the plants in the Australian National Herbarium. We've had Paco Calvo and Natalie Lawrence, who recently wrote a book called Planta Sapiens, and that book is a really good collection of information and overview of plant intelligence, and really discusses some of the research on that. And we've also had Michael Martyr and Giovanni Aloy talking about their recent book on art and philosophy and plants. So we're trying to provide a broad way for people to learn more about plants. Upcoming, we have another program, and all our programs are free and they're available online and also recorded. If you miss them and want to find them, you can go to the Plant Initiative's YouTube site or our website and access all of the recordings. So we're on January 31st, 2024. We're going to have a program on plant intelligence and ethics, and that's going to be with Alessandro Viola, and that'll be, just in a couple weeks from now.
Yeah, and she co-authored that excellent book with Dr. Mancuso, right? The biologist in Italy.
Correct. That's
Right.
correct. And so I think that, we kind of see ourselves as an international kind of based organization. Even though I'm located here in Minnesota, we have board members in a variety of different states, and our audience is really people throughout the world that are interested in this topic. We put out a monthly email newsletter, which is free, available. You can subscribe through our website, or also it's archived online. And we try and provide a listing of all different types of events and resources and opportunities, of which there are actually quite a few. I think one thing that makes the organization a little bit unique is that we're not just based in the scientific worldview. And so we try and also promote events and opportunities that involve, I'd say, other ways of knowing things. So it could be through intuition or, cultural perceptions of things. And so we're trying to not limit ourselves just to kind of conventional, accepted Western ways of knowing things, but also, want to be respectful of that, both indigenous cultures as well as many alternative cultures within our dominant society also have ways of learning about and communicating and connecting with other beings that are not really science-based.
Absolutely. Yeah. And people can go to plantinitiative.org to
Correct.
see all of these things, to find links to all these things, right? I thought it might be useful if we're going to dive into the report. I just wanted to read the first couple of paragraphs of it, just to give people sort of a flavor of it. And so I was going to start there. There's not currently an identifiable movement that advocates on behalf of plants. Serious consideration of ethical treatment of plants, plant rights, and plant personhood remains on the margins of academic thought and popular understanding. However, there are many disconnected components of what could potentially constitute such a movement. This report presents reasons why such a movement is timely, outlines challenges that such a movement would face, considers what can be learned from the animal advocacy movement, and suggests potential approaches that could be used for operationalizing a plant advocacy movement. And so within the report, you have a few sections. For example, trends supporting a plant advocacy movement, challenges facing the plant advocacy movement, what can be learned from the animal advocacy movement, and how can plant ethics be operationalized. So I thought we might just start with your first section there, trends supporting a plant advocacy movement. And there you're talking about different organizations or different movements, or maybe different kinds of thoughts that have been moving around in the culture that already support a plant advocacy movement that could sort of provide a starting point. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. I part of the reason for starting the Plant Initiative at this time was that it seems like there's a multitude of factors that are kind of coming together. They're kind of converging and really support at least people looking at plants in this different way. So one of the things I've mentioned already is just that there's a lot of scientific research that's being done on plants and plant consciousness and plant intelligence. And a lot of this has really been seeping into the kind of the public sphere. Just if you ask people, can plants communicate with each other? Or there's people that are familiar with some of the research that's been done by Suzanne Simard and others on how, in forests that the trees can exchange information and nutrients between each other using mycorrhizae in the soil. And there's been increasing numbers of people that have been doing research that are identifying some very advanced capabilities of plants. So I think that one of the reasons that people can start looking at plants in a different way is just that there is more known now about plants and what they are really capable of. And another issue is within the academic world. There's been a greater focus on plants in philosophy and environmental ethics. There's something called the quote vegetal turn. It's an academic term, but it just means that for a variety of reasons, plants are starting to become more cool to think about and to write about and to research. And so that's another thing, independently of what's going on with the scientists. This is more the humanities, where people are starting to think more about plants. And one of the things that's probably contributed as well is just during COVID, a lot of people were inside and their regular routines were somewhat broken, and they started having more connection maybe with the plants in their lives. Maybe they bought some house plants to keep them company in their home while they were kind of trapped in there, or they were spending more time in their yard or in parks. But anyway, I think that also opened up people's time and minds in terms of connecting with plants. And another thing that's really contributing to this being timely is the Rights of Nature movement, which is an international movement through which basically different governmental units, small or large, are starting to recognize that the natural world has its own rights and it should have legal standing. And when you start talking about the natural world, that of course is going to include plants, because if you look at what is alive on this planet and what do people see, most of the living biomass, almost all of it on this planet, on the surface of the planet, is plants. And so when we're talking about rights of nature, rights of forests, we're talking in a way about rights of plants, even if they might not be specifically talking about plant rights. So plants are benefiting from this broader rights of nature movement, which is really starting to have some early successes in countries such as Ecuador and other places, where they're actually starting to have legal decisions in courts that will stop certain types of destructive mining or other projects just because of what the implications for the natural world and the standing of the natural world that needs to be considered. Another factor is animal rights. Animal advocacy has been very successful in terms of getting people to think about the obligations that they have to treat other non-human beings well. And that is reflected both in terms of veganism, where people want to avoid eating any animal products that are raised, on farms or killed or otherwise. And also just, some people don't go that far and they are interested in just more humane treatment of animals. But I think that people are very connected with animals in many ways. They have pets. They realize that animals are sensitive beings that can feel pain, that have emotions like we do. And so there's increasing comfort with that and increasing legal also recognition of that and standards, that people have to follow when they're dealing with animals. And we feel that sets the tone for potentially extending that beyond animals. I think one of the challenges with the animal rights movement, even with all of its successes, and and I support, the animal rights movement, is just that there is a line there. I think that, like right now, there's a line for many people between what's okay to do for a human and what's okay to do for an animal. And that expresses itself in terms of how animals are raised. But the animal rights movement has set another line, and and there's what's okay for animals. And then if you're a plant or fungi or microorganism or mineral or whatever, you're not really covered by that. So they've in a way drawn a line, and it's an appropriate thing to do to include animals, but we're just saying that let's include other living beings as well, not just animals. There's also been a trend towards increasing greater openness to indigenous and other alternative ways of knowing. And I've mentioned that the Plant Initiative is supports people considering those ways of understanding the natural world. And I think that indigenous culture, I can't identify as an indigenous person to express that, and better for indigenous people to express their own culture. But my understanding is that it really involves a sense of reciprocity and relatedness with all the beings on the planet. And so when you start looking more horizontally at other beings on the planet and a more permeable way of relating to other beings on the planet, I think that really is helpful in terms of people connecting more to plants. And I think one other issue is just that we're in the middle of an ecological crisis for people that are tracking what's going on with biodiversity, what's going on with the various habitats throughout the world. They're under a lot of stress, both because of climate change, because of habitat destruction, because of pollution, a lot of other reasons. And I think that as people are concerned and they want to help to preserve our planet, a lot of that is going to include preserving plant life on the planet, because as I mentioned, almost all of the living biomass on this planet are plants. So when we want to preserve ecosystems, we want to preserve the environment, that's also preserving plants. And I think the plants also are now known through research to improve human quality of life. That when we are out in a green area, green space, or even just looking at green plants, there's health benefits for us. And so there's I think more of a recognition of how we relate to plants and what we benefit from plants. And I think all those factors that I've just mentioned are helping to lead towards potentially people seeing that they should be advocating for plants or treating them more respectfully.
Absolutely. Yeah, you didn't use the word say human supremacism or human centrism, for example, but I think that is one of the things that's been eroding slowly over the last few years due to some of these factors that you mentioned. So animal rights activists have definitely been trying to address human centrism and say, no, there are other creatures on the planet who also deserve, consideration, and then as people have become more acquainted with different indigenous views, those too, can be less, human centrism. And obviously, indigenous views and cultures are not monolithic, and there's many different kinds around the world that exist and have existed, but many of them do contain these threads or these strains of thought that are useful in this way and helpful in looking at the world in a different way that have been largely absent in Western thought, and certainly in agricultural in the agricultural way of looking at things. And I think it's very interesting that you have a background in would you say agronomy? It was right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was weed science, actually.
Right. Okay. Right. Yeah. And I've been involved in farming in a lot of different ways. And sometimes as a plant lover or a plant advocate, working on farms has felt a little bit like maybe the kind of work that people do who are prison abolitionists. And so they go into prisons to work with prisoners, Sometimes it's felt a little bit like that, like where one of the best places to advocate for plants is on farms, because that's one of the front lines.
Well, I feel strongly about it in that I think that if you look at just the land mass that is covered with crop plants and plants used for agricultural purposes, otherwise it's really huge. So if we want to advocate for plants and how they're treated, I think we do have to get into the agricultural sphere. And I think that's a more fraught area. I think it's a lot easier for people to think about respecting like a 2,000-year-old redwood tree,
Right.
or maybe their house plant, or a house, or a tree in the park, or in their, or, a bush in their yard. When you start thinking about these, quote, agricultural plants, they fall within kind of a different category, similar to what's happened in the animal rights movement, where you have people that will be maybe concerned with dogs, cats, rare endangered animals, whales, elephants, but yet, they're not necessarily as concerned about, cows, pigs, chickens that are raised in confined areas, and have really awful lives in many cases. So, I think that it's easy to compartmentalize, and I think that it's important when you think about plants to take a broad picture of plants, although it makes it a lot more complicated to advocate, because we are ultimately all dependent on, killing plants, eating plants, using plants to live. We're animals. We are not able to produce our own food from sunlight. We're dependent on plants who can photosynthesize to produce basically all of our food directly or indirectly. So whether we're eating plants directly or we're eating animals that are eating plants, we're dependent on killing plants to live. And so it's harder to have like moral clarity in terms of how you deal with plants, was as compared with maybe like an endangered species, or a panda. Everyone could say, well, there's no reason we have to kill a panda. We could protect them all, set them aside. With plants, it's not that simple. And so I think that it calls for a challenging set of ways of interacting with agricultural plants and plants in general, and that it's not, you can't just segment them off and say, well, we're not going to kill them or use them. But I think that, we can learn a lot from indigenous perspectives, where, we're using something, or having that kind of relationship. It's life moves between various beings, and we're all interdependent, and we all have things to give each other and things to get from each other. So it's, instead of looking at just putting them aside as we don't touch them, it's more about how do we relate to them in a way that benefits them and respects them, but also allows us to survive. So I think that's the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked in here about considering plants in a relational way, and I really, I really that phrase particularly jumped out at me in my own writing, in my current projects. The phrase "living in relation" has been the one that comes up more and more, and that we're not currently living in relation, with our food plants, most of us as individuals in the society, and then the approach of agriculture is generally not living in relation. It's seeing plants as resources, to be used, not just for food, but for making money, for economic, concerns. And so that idea of living in relation, I think that's one of the keys to bring into this, to change how the discussion is, because agriculture, as you know, is fundamentally, it's fundamentally a sort of a domineering process, the way that it works right now, especially in the industrial level. And I think that there's cultural reasons that this exists. There's the the quote dominion over all animals and plants, so that appears in Genesis there, and so those books were written by early agricultural societies as ways of describing their world and how they're going to relate to it. And so some of that goes back a ways. I also think that with plants and with agriculture, people are always like, that the sort of fallback is, oh, well, we have to eat, And of course we have to eat, but I think that there's a lack of understanding, especially in the United States, about how agriculture actually works and how much of it is focused, specifically on us eating. So something like 40% of the landmass of the United States is devoted to agriculture and to pasture and rangelands, right? Nearly half. I mean, it's amazing, right? However, of all that land, only 20% is comprised by what people think of as what farming is. So like vegetables, fruits, nut orchards, olive oil orchards, grains, beans. That's only 20% of all of that agricultural land. Other big sections are growing a lot of corn for biofuels, right? That's something that we can talk about, that whether we should need to do that or how useful is that. Some of it is for export. So it's not for feeding people here, it's for making money for the farmers. So again, this is not simply just we need to eat, And then of course, a large portion of it, the largest portion of our agricultural land is raising food to feed to animals, And so, and of course the animal rights movement, vegans, et cetera, have done a really good job of pointing out, is that necessary? Do people need to eat that much meat? We don't need to get into all of that today. But the main point I just wanted to make was just that when it comes to farming, people don't realize what a small amount of the farming industry at this point really is for what they're picking up in the produce section at the store.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really a good point. I think that, right. I think people have to, I think it's important in general, like what you're saying, is to segment the way that we look at agriculture and to recognizing that there are various types of agriculture. And when you're talking about industrial agriculture and the way that you did, I think that's really important, because that's the vast acreage that exists in our culture here. But there are, through indigenous agriculture and some of the other agricultural systems, which I know you're well acquainted with like permaculture, biodynamics, organic agriculture, sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture. There's a lot of different subtypes of agriculture which have different ways of looking at the plants that are involved. And some of those forms of agriculture, I would say, do involve respectfully connecting with those plants that are being grown. I think, particularly when you have a smaller scale, there's an ability for farmers or growers or horticulturalists or whoever to have more of an individual relationship with the plants, and to make sure that each individual plant is having as good a life as it could, is able to flourish as well as it could. And that's really hard to do at a scale for agricultural crops. If you're growing, let's say, thousands of acres of corn or soybeans, you don't have that ability to have that kind of personal connection. So, but I think that it's good to recognize that the agriculture is a super important area in terms of looking at plants ethically, and that there's a lot of implications to that.
Yeah, and the land use being not the smallest of them, because if we're talking about wanting to protect, if we're wanting to talk about protecting plants and ecosystems that are not domesticated, the single biggest threat to ecosystems is habitat destruction through human use. And the biggest category of habitat destruction is agriculture. The Amazon is, they're cutting down parts of the Amazon because they want to grow soy, or they want to put in, palm plantations or something like that. And while there's also, say, mining, that's going on in the Amazon, that's taking up a much smaller footprint, although obviously it has its own, toxic, legacy as well. So I think that the realizing that it's very important to try to protect those areas that haven't been strongly disturbed at this point means needing to look at agriculture and how does it need to continue expanding in the way that it is,
Well, I think,
Mhm,
go ahead.
well, are the motivations for its expansion having to do with feeding people, or are they having to do with, profit? And if we were to be, if we were to have a different kind of agricultural system that wasn't so focused on profit, could we, first of all, not destroy any more habitat, and then secondly, shrink the amount of land that we're using for agriculture right now, and so that some of it could be rewilded or have other approaches happen to it.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about agriculture is that because you're working with living beings, there are always a lot of alternative ways of interacting with them. And so some of the more, agroecological ways of growing crops, there's ways that can actually increase biodiversity depending on how you're growing the crops. And it wouldn't maybe make sense for certain types of industrial agriculture to do certain of these agroecological techniques, but there are ways that we can grow plants that will be good for the plants as well as for the earth, as well as for our own health. And so I think it's more of a question of like having people want to do that too. I think right now there's like a lot of incentives and subsidies and reasons why people are growing crops the way they do. And as you point out, a lot of it's not used for human food at all, and it's used for things that maybe even not very positive for anyone involved, So I think that, there are ways of doing things. One thing I think about, and I don't know, it's a little off topic, but like with certain plants like corn, which are considered sacred beings, in many indigenous cultures, and when we kind of break the contract with that plant that they have in the indigenous cultures to treat it respectfully and to honor it, and we just kind of use it for just what humans want in the dominant culture, there's like a price to be paid. And I've kind of thought about that in terms of tobacco, another sacred plant that's kind of misused in the dominant culture. People, I wonder if there's like a free ride for exploiting other beings. I think
Right.
when you don't treat beings respectfully, there's consequences. And I think so for tobacco, we know the health impacts of that. And there's also problems in terms of soil fertility or whatever. And then in terms of corn as well, some of the products that are made from corn, through industrial processes like high fructose corn syrup, or various industrial things, or animals that are fed in feedlots with corn, and then there's or fertilization for corn that's creating dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico in North America. So I think there's no like free ride. I think we have to start looking, not only because it's the right thing to do for these other beings, the other plant beings, our relatives, but also because it's ultimately going to come back to us when we don't act respectfully. So I think it's like really important for our own like survival and for our planet's survival that we reorient the way that we look at and interact with plants, both in agricultural, horticultural, any kind of setting, because it's not, we think we're kind of getting away with something and doing what we want, but ultimately the bill is going to come due and is coming due.
Right. Right now, I'm glad you mentioned corn, because that can provide a good segue for us back to plants and the idea of plant communication and senses. And that's that one of the accidents that happened in the domestication of corn after colonization, because is that whenever you're selecting a plant or a vegetable for one trait, and you end up losing other ones or gaining other ones just accidentally, as a matter of course, and so you might breed a plant to grow shorter, but then that's also going to maybe have lower protein count in its seeds or something like that, right? So lots of things like that have happened with wheat, but with corn particularly, corn used to have an ability to signal to particular to particular insect predators when needed. So one of the insects that is considered a pest of corn is the root borer, right? So I'm not sure if that's a moth or a beetle, but at the larval stage, it gets into the roots of the corn and harms the plant. So corn used to have the ability, when it was being attacked by the root borer, to send out a chemical signal that would attract predatory wasps, I believe it was, who would come, and it might be one of these cases where the wasps lay their eggs in the larvae or whatever. But anyway, however that mechanism was, the wasps would come and they would knock back the population of the root borer, right? So that quality of corn that it used to have, it lost accidentally along the way in the rather intense breeding practices that we've done with it, and so now that the corn can't defend itself against root borers, which has led to, of course, more chemical use, and then we all know that the chemicals, don't stay in the field. They end up doing, different things. But I think that, this is getting back to the point you made before, that there's been more public consciousness lately about different discoveries that have been made. And one of those, a lot of those have been around the fact that plants are able to communicate both with each other and with insects, in order to, for their own benefit. I think a lot of this is happening through chemicals that they release into the air, right? Something we could even call pheromones, perhaps. Did you want to talk about a bit about that for a moment?
Well, I there's various volatile compounds, chemical compounds that plants can use for communicating, both in the air as well as through the soil, to help to, warn other plants that are near them, that there's a pest there. So these other plants can create various secondary metabolic compounds that can protect them, that could be, toxic, or that could help to dissuade some of these predators from eating. So I think that it's another good point about plants, is that they do live in community. We think of plants as individuals, and I think when we think of rights and things like that, we typically think of individuals. But for plants, their lives are very intertwined with many other organisms, both other plants, through which they have relationships, as you point out, through being able to communicate through chemical signals in a very complex language with many types of chemical signals, and then also with bacteria, with fungi, they're with insects. Plants are very resourceful and able to meet their needs through collective kind of collaboration. And I think that's it's another reason I think to respect them, is just that they are very complex beings that are doing a lot. They're doing a lot that maybe we can't see. There's thoughts that plants are even using sound. They're certainly able to perceive sound. For example, there's been research when caterpillars are eating a leaf of a plant, they will send out signals that can notify other people just by playing the sound of a caterpillar eating a leaf. It will cause plants to change their chemical compounds and structure. So and bees as well. So they're listening, they're watching, they're sharing information, they're sharing nutrients, they're protecting each other. They're doing a lot, and I think it's really pretty amazing when you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that what's become clear is that we can definitely say that plants have senses of different kinds, and some of those are really obvious ones, like that there are, the roots have, of plants have the abilities to detect moisture and to go, and to grow towards it or away from it as they need to, or certain minerals in the soil and to grow towards it or away from it. There are plants whose seeds require light for germination. There are, and so these are all senses that they're able to pick up on these different, on these different, the light, the temperature, the chemicals. There's, plants that need to get cold before the seeds need to get cold before they'll germinate. So all of these are senses. And then we pile on top of senses that we have, that they are also responses that are then going on, so they're sensing something, then they're responding. It's not plant growth is not a random process in that way, and then I also recall, maybe it was in Mancuso's book, reading about a fascinating experiment where this woman did research on sensitive plants. Those are plants in the genus Mimosa, right? So the sensitive plant, a lot of people might know those ones from a nursery or whatever. That's the plant that you touch its leaves and they fold up, and so they respond to being touched or to a vibration. And so what she did is she had quite a few of these plants in hanging baskets in the laboratory, and she had it set up so that she could have the basket drop slightly and just give it a little bit of vibration, and that would cause the plant leaves to fold up as if it had been touched because it had been agitated. But what she found was that if she repeated this over time, at some point they stopped doing it, because what appeared to be happening anyway, or how we would talk about, is that it appeared that they were learning that this was not a real threat, that they didn't need to expend the resources to fold up like this. And so this further seemed to suggest something like memory. And so this is where people get into different discussions about, oh, but they don't have a brainstem. Oh, they don't have nerve cells like animals do, so we can't consider that, quote, thinking or memory or something like that. And I think that this is where plant rights or advocating for plants is different than advocating for animals, because where a lot of advocacy for animals has been about showing how much animals are like us. I mean, we are a kind of animal after a while, maybe to some degree sort of humanizing animals in order to make us feel a closer connection to them. I think that's not possible in the same way with plants, because they are so different, but I don't think it is necessary either. And I think that in terms of plants, I think that there's not a need to create that same equivalency as there is, and that it's more important to look at plants in terms of the fact that although they are different, that difference does not make them less legitimate.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, with just about that study by her name is Monica Gagliano. If people are interested,
Gagliano.
She's written a very interesting book called "Thus Spoke the Plant" too, if you're interested in her writing about her own work. But she, yeah, I think that, I guess for me, I think of like, I think the typical way of thinking about intelligence is that it's like a human characteristic. And then if you want to say that any other being is intelligent, then the burden of proof is on you to prove it. I guess for me, I'm thinking that every living being, including bacteria and microorganisms, they're all intelligent because, like you pointed out, every being is sensing a variety of different things: light, sound, temperature, moisture, all these different things. But they're integrating it. They're not like just giving like a rote response. It's not like, because it couldn't function that way. They have to be able to balance the fact that, okay, there's more water in this direction, but then there's more light in the other direction. And actually there's like a lawnmower that comes over and cuts us down at 7 inches. And then there's a bunch of insect pests. So they have to like figure out how to do all that. And every organism, whether it's an amoeba or a plant or a person or an animal, whatever, has to be able to integrate it. So I would say, every living being is intelligent. And it does get at this whole issue about anthropocentrism, looking at everything from a human perspective, where we're the center of the universe, and then everything is like important as it relates to us. And I would say that I guess I see it as a more horizontal type of a way of looking at all the living beings. It's that they're all like equally advanced, they're all like equally important, and that they all, therefore, they're like beings that we need to be connecting with respectfully. So, but I think that you're right. The research that's been done on plant intelligence and plant sensing is good. One flaw in a way is thinking that just because we realize that plants are sensitive or intelligent or even conscious, that we're going to treat them well, because we do not yet treat humans well, as you can
Right.
read from the news every day. So,
Mhm.
so it's not like a guarantee. It's a nice step towards a more respectful way of being, but I think that it won't help enough, because even with farm animals on farms, people understand that they're suffering, that they're in bad conditions, and they're still doing it. So it's just having the raw understanding is not going to be enough, but it does help to make the case, and it does raise the ethical stakes, and it makes it a more complex thing. And so I think it pushes people in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There was one, uh, there was one, and you were talking about, different challenges facing the plant advocacy movement. We already talked a little bit about how, um, some animal rights activists are drawing a line, and saying, okay, animals are worth advocating for because of their different qualities and plants are. And I think that not all animal rights activists fall into
No.
that category. And so there's that kind of that line that's drawn there. And as I said, I think that well, there shouldn't be a line, when it comes to respecting, a life on Earth. But that also we can recognize that plants are legitimate, even though they're different. But one possibility you mentioned in here or that you were talking about that was a trend that's getting more people interested in plant advocacy was the native plant movement. And there's one in terms of I mean, and I love native plants, and I love native ecosystems, and I've supported tree sits, and I've in that sense literally broken the law to help defend native plants. But the topic of invasive plants is in the native plant movement is, I think, a little bit problematic for the plant advocacy movement, because what they're doing there is drawing a line and saying, here are plants that are worth saving, and here are plants that are not worth saving. And there's a demonization that often happens of the introduced plants. And just with that word invasive, which makes it sound like they're armies or parachuters or tanks, right? So there's that's going on. And then there's also a lack of recognition that in the vast majority of cases, introduced plants are not able to establish in a new environment without human disturbance. And so human disturbance being the vector for these new plants, human disturbance is what needs to be addressed, And so you can have sort of the because crop plants are not considered invasive, that they get the exception, right? They get the pass, right? And so you have the perversity of being able to stand, in the middle of like an agricultural zone, like the Central Valley, or the Midwest or wherever, where it's agriculture as far as you can see to the horizon, and but the criticism, and the bile or whatever is being brought to bear against a few plants that happen to be growing along the road or in the ditch there, as being not native and not belonging, and being like, well, they wouldn't be here if the road wasn't here and the farm field or the orchard wasn't here, And so that's where, and certainly not all native plant advocates have this attitude. I think that it's a subset, who this is their cause is that they want to, they want to get rid of all introduced plants, and some of them use very violent rhetoric, along this too. And so I just wanted to bring that up because it hadn't been mentioned in your report, but I felt like it was a challenge that's out there too.
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like they're not being respected adequately, the non-native plants. I realize that there are situations. I think there's no like hard and fast rule that you can't again kill a plant or remove a plant or change the composition of plants in the environment. So I think that I'm not saying to take a hard line on this, but I would agree with you that, that they're being unfairly demonized. They're just trying to live their life. They were brought there by human interference, as you point out. And, there's a lot of ecological benefits to them being there. They're
Yeah.
providing, shade, habitat, they're preventing soil erosion, they're doing things. And also plant communities are not permanent. So let's
Right.
say you have a situation where there's invasive plants or they've taken over a certain area. It doesn't mean that looking ahead 50, 100, 500 years, if you leave it alone, that there's still going to be a monoculture of whatever it is, that plant that you don't like. Things change, and the living world has the ability to correct itself. So it's also a sense that humans have this obligation to manage the non-human world because we know best. But I would say I'm skeptical, just
Yep.
looking
Right.
around and seeing what human management looks like. I would say it's not really working very well. So I would say if you have a situation where there's plants that maybe are out of place or that you don't really like them, if you take the long view, I believe that problem will correct itself eventually. Because around the world in natural environments, in wild environments, you don't really see that there's just one plant that will just completely dominate the landscape forever without human interference. So eventually it would correct itself. And I would say people should be patient and understand some of the benefits that these other plants, a lot of these, non-native plants are companions with humans for thousands of years and are related to our crop plants. They have medicinal gifts that they can give to people. They're maybe beautiful, so there's a lot of different aspects of what they're doing, that should make us rethink, the negativity that goes towards them. And I agree, it's not everyone, but I think that, it's important to kind of go out of your way to think about how can these plants that we don't particularly think we like, how can they actually be looked at in a positive light?
Right. Right. Yeah. I think that recognizing the subjective quality there is important too, and is often not acknowledged, and so the idea that, because it is in so many cases simply that, it's that plant is not liked, or for some reason, being able to prove that a plant is bad for a place is actually a very challenging thing to do, and in the field of invasion biology itself, there's a great lack of consensus. They're having debates all the time. Like they on the science end of it, it's a very nuanced, discussion, sort of in contrast to what's happening in popular media or in certain circles or whatever. But just for me as as someone who's advocating for plants and, really advocating for life, but, in terms of advocating for plants, I would say that, the approach should be that, you know, uh, death and killing things is an inevitable part of life. However, we should just not kill things without a good reason. There needs to be, and I don't consider aesthetics to be a good reason. I don't consider merely the pursuit of profit to be a good reason, et cetera. And so in that case, in that sense, this is I would say that this is an ethical, issue for me. And you do address ethics in this report as well.
Yeah, well, I think that having a good reason is important, but also to include with your good reason, weighing the consequences on these other living plant beings and including that in that whole broader equation. So, because people do a lot of really bad things for good reasons. You know what I
Right.
mean? It's like they
Mhm.
think it's a good reason, and then they're doing horrendous things. So, but I think that, so it has to be both having a good reason and thinking about, well, you're destroying this other being's life, and that being doesn't want to have a destroyed life. So put that in your equation too and think about it, because that other being still wanted to live.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, in terms of, you had a section in the report, how can plant ethics be operationalized? And that was kind of a big word. And I thought maybe you could, talk a little bit about what you meant in this section.
Well, I think one of the challenges is, it's kind of an abstract concept to think about, well, we want to promote respect for plants, or we should treat plants ethically. So I think one of the challenges will, beyond just maybe people on an intellectual level thinking, well, that maybe we should, but then what does it mean to do it? And I
Right.
think that's part of the challenge. And so, there are ways that, we have some things on our website that we mention, in terms of how we can, treat plants, more respectfully. There's, reducing consumption of plants when it's not needed, and there's a lot of ways of doing that. So you don't waste plant lives, protecting and restoring plants, rethinking plants, putting in place, policies, that could, encourage people to think about plants in a different way, in a more positive way, teaching people about it. So it involves, education, outreach. In some cases, it might involve, policies towards various types of plants. But it's like the challenge is to, like, how do you take this, like the animal rights movement has, they've had a concept of we want to protect animals and that they should be treated respectfully and all that. And then they've kind of come up with various things. There's different laws. There's, humane treatment of animals, or there's veganism. I think for there, and there's many other, types of ways that people are voluntarily or non-voluntarily dealing with improving the lot of animals. And so I think for plants as well, I'm just saying, at least take the first steps towards thinking about how can we actually move forward with this as a serious issue. Because I think there's a tendency to put down people that care about plants. There's like expressions like tree huggers. It's kind of seems, for some people, it seems on the fringe, and so I think it's to be taken seriously. It has to kind of, make people think that there's some action that needs to be done. So that's kind of what I mean by operationalizing it.
Right. 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 And it's funny that, it should be considered fringe, to be interested in, a form of life on the planet, the kingdom of plants, without which our life here would be completely impossible.
Well, I agree. I think it's somewhat arrogant for people, and again gets back to anthropocentrism or human-centered thinking. That we're the center of everything here, and everything is here to serve us, and we have the right to do whatever we want to every other living being. And so I think that that's not true. And I think that the outcome of that attitude is what you see right now in terms
Right.
of the ecological crisis that we're in. And that's what happens when you're not respecting the fact that all these other beings need to live here, and you think you can just do whatever you want. And then you're seeing the other beings dying out, they're leaving. The earth is in a very critical state right now. And so I think that it's important for our survival as a species to rethink and reorient the way that we look at plants, as well as all other living beings.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I completely agree with that. And I do think that this does end up going, this ends up, well, this involves systemic things that are going on, not merely individual actions, but systems and policy. And it's rooted in, a lot of these cultural ideas, too. And so that's why, really, it's not, really just about like, mentioning facts or this or that, but as you brought up in the report, that there's an important of, story and emotions and fueling the movement is how you put it. And so really what we're talking about here is trying to introduce a different narrative or different narratives.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think if the Plant Initiative play a small part in promoting that and podcasts like this where you're thinking through these issues, and I know you've been thinking about these issues for a long time on your own, and I think that there's a need, I think, though, for people that are starting to think this way about plants to start to build connections with each other, to build collaboration, and to draw both encouragement from each other, to share and support each other, and to legitimize each other in this kind of a work. So I think that's one of the things that the Plant Initiative is trying to do through its programming, is to help build that sense that there are others that think this way, that this is an important and a legitimate way of thinking about so many other living beings, and that there's an opportunity to do a lot more.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited the Plant Initiative is even happening, and it was great to look at this report, and I really appreciate that you spent some time today talking to me about this. And can you just remind our viewers and listeners how they can follow the work?
Sure. On our website, plantinitiative.org, you can sign up for our email newsletter. We also have archived past copies of our newsletter. We have a YouTube site. We have an active Twitter site, Facebook. So there's a lot of ways that you can connect with us. And if you have any questions about anything, I can be reached at info@plantinitiative.org. My name again is Paul Moss, and I'm the executive director.
And what are the handles that you use on social media?
It's, I don't actually say them very often, but I think on Twitter it's PLANT_INIT, and Facebook. I wish I knew.
I'll look them up and put them in the description. Yeah.
Thank you. But you can find it, and if you go to our website, you'll see the little symbols, and then you'll be able to access the social media sites there.
Okay. Are you on TikTok yet?
No.
Okay. Need to find a young person to help you put some stuff on TikTok, because that's really where it's happening now,
I know.
Right. Well, thank you very much today, Paul. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much too. I enjoyed it. Take care.
So I just want to let you know, I'll cut it there for the thing.
Okay.
What I plan to do with this is to do a writing piece about it too.
Okay, great.
Probably not a full transcription, but just an article, talking about the points. And I'll put that on my own blog, but then I'm also going to, shop that around to a couple of other different websites that have sometimes published, my stuff, to see if we can get it out there. And, I'm looking at February sometime,
whatever
it's going to take a little,
for you.
It'll take a little while to edit this into what it needs to be, and then to write something up from it. And I'm in the middle of finishing up a book right now with my friend. And so that's kind of the main thing.
What's it about? What's your book about?
The working title is Don't Blame the Messengers, a critique of the invasive plant narrative.
Right. Great.
Right. And so there have been, some good books on that topic in the past. You might have known about Tara Ryan wrote a great book called Beyond the one. Right. Yeah, I interviewed her on my last podcast. She's awesome.
Great.
Fred Pierce had a book that came out that same year, Where Are Camels From? About 10, 12 years ago, there was a few books that came out, but there hasn't actually been anything since. And so it's time for something else. And so, my co-author and I, we put out a zine on the topic a few years ago, and then we decided to take the zine and expand it into a book. And so we're going to be covering, a lot of the same material that these other books do, but then also bringing in some elements that they didn't as well. And,
great.
I'm encouraged, because even though there's a really vociferous group of people out there who are just, invasive plant haters, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Who really, they're a small group, they're
well-meaning. They're well-meaning in the way
they're well-meaning. But they're a small group too, and there's a lot of native plant people who aren't in that category.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people who are just simply not aware of the issue very much at this point either, who can be introduced to a different way of thinking about them, like I think that as a cause, uh there's really some room for a pushback against that narrative having some success, because like when I've a lot of times when we talk to people in person, they're relieved to find out that there's a different way of looking at these things, and they're relieved to find out that they don't have to hate that plant, because maybe they're like, oh, I'm supposed to hate that plant, but maybe they don't actually. And so when you really introduce a different way of thinking about it, they're like, oh, I don't have to hate that plant, because
That's neat.
well, the vast majority of people don't actually want to hate things, because hating
That's
things
true.
hating things isn't really very fun. You know what I mean? It gets your blood pressure up. I mean, you know what I mean? Like it's not
Yeah.
actually pleasant to feel hatred. You know what I mean? And so
And
people
yeah.
are relieved, Yeah. And so
And
there's
it's
this.
not a winnable battle either. So it's going to
No,
be
absolutely
constant
not. No.
frustration.
Yeah, no,
It's
we need to,
never,
we just need to accept that the world is different at this point. But yeah, I have, am part of a sort of a loose network of people who have been thinking about these things. Some of them are in like sort of the primitive skills scene. Some of them are in the foraging scene.
great.
Some of them are different plant people, but there is definitely oh, hey, let's rethink this whole introduced plant thing. There's definitely something bubbling up there around the edges, culturally and also in the science, because I've been reading the journals and looking in this and that, and there's plenty of researchers who are like, I think we were getting a little carried away with this in the 90s, and we need to take a couple of steps back now. I mean, that's where they're at, but there's some of the same challenges here as there is with anything, as then there's big money.
Yeah, the herbicide companies are,
that's a
they
big
won't
part
like
of it.
this.
No, because when they formed when the federal government formed the Invasive Species Council in the late 90s under in the Clinton administration, the people who were sitting on the original committee to form it included people from Monsanto and Dow Chemical. I mean, it was just like, so from the beginning, you had these people wanting to make money off of herbicides who were defining the issue. And you know what I mean? It was just like, I don't know. You start to point some of those things out though, and people are like, oh, So anyway.
Hey, are you connected with Pete Yeo over in UK? Do you know him from Future Flora?
No, you sent me the website, and I went and I looked at it.
You would like him because he's thinking very much like you are.
Right. So, right. Yeah. No, I saw that. Yeah.
Okay. Good.
No, there's some interesting folks out there, and so it's cool. And we hope to finish the draft of the book late this winter, and then we're gonna go through the process of trying to find a publisher, which I've never gone through. I don't know how hard that's going to be. But we can send you an electronic copy of the draft if you're interested in seeing it. So
sure, it'd be interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
we'll be looking for feedback, and also for people to write blurbs for the back.
Well, I don't think I would add much clout, but anyway, that would be interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, I really appreciate. I really appreciate that you talked to me today, and I'll let you know when this is coming out. And
it was great. I enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for asking.
Yeah, thank you. You have a good one.
Okay. Yeah, take care.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, is also a blog at colibri.substack.com. That's KOLLIBRI.substack.com. Paid subscribers get exclusive blog posts and early access to podcast episodes. Intro beats by Big Joe Drummer. This outro music by Codebox. Join us again for another episode of Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, the podcast.